My dear friends, tonight I'm going to share with you the incredible story of a man who carved his name into the depths of history, Cyrus the Great. Yes, that name might sound familiar to many of you. But let me tell you, this man was not just a conqueror, he was one of the most significant leaders in human history. Let's trace the footsteps of this great leader who laid the foundations of the vast Persian Empire, witness his conquests, and see how he changed the course of world history. The sights those eyes have seen, the sounds those ears have heard. Just imagine for a moment. In the midst of time, in what we now know as Iran, there lies the boundless realm of Persia. King Cyrus moves like an unstoppable storm, sweeping from east to west. His first strike against the Medes Empire, followed by his conquest of the wealth-laden Lydian kingdom and the silent breach of Babylon's legendary walls. Each victory further elevates his name, earning him the title the beloved of the gods. But dear friends, this story is not just about wars and conquests, it's also about justice, tolerance, and the birth of an empire. This tale shows how Cyrus brought people together through his fair governance and how he managed a colossal empire with the order he established. Are you ready? Because the storm of Cyrus is about to unfold the dusty pages of history one by one and invite you into this magnificent world. My dear friends, I'm taking you back to a very ancient time, to a period when the lands of Persia were still hidden in the shadows. Back then, the Persians lived far from their current glory, under the rule of the Medes. They were farmers, shepherds, or warriors, but they had no idea they were on the brink of a significant transformation in their history. Because during that time, a child was growing up among this people, a child who would one day change the fate of empires. That child was none other than Cyrus. Cyrus was no ordinary kid. This young prince, raised in the Medes palace, was dazzling everyone with his intelligence and determination. His grandfather, Astyages, was the powerful king of the Medes, and in the future, Astyages would start to see Cyrus's rise as a threat. But my dear friends, that's just the twist of fate. While young Cyrus continued to gather strength in the Medes palace, the fire within him kept growing. He knew that his people were waiting for not just a ruler, but a savior. At that time, the Medes Empire was vast and wealthy, but it was built on a decaying structure. King Astyages ruled with an iron fist and cruelty. The Persians were a people growing up in the shadow of this kingdom. Just think, before Cyrus's leadership, the Persians were a community ruled by the Medes, but Cyrus had a completely different vision in mind. He didn't just want his people to break free from oppression, he dreamed of rewriting the fate of the entire region. As the years went by, Cyrus's charisma spread not just among the Persians, but also within the Medes' army and people. His heart was filled with justice and courage, and eventually he became a beacon of hope for those oppressed under Astyages' cruel rule. Rumors ignited a rebellion against the Medes under Cyrus's leadership. Even the Medes' army began to betray their own king out of respect for this young leader. And that's how Cyrus's rise began, dear listeners. The Persians united under him and prepared for a great war against the Medes. This battle would change the fate of not just two peoples, but the entire region. And my dear friends, this war wasn't won just by clashing weapons, it was the power of intellect and strategy that made the difference. With his intelligence and determination, Cyrus defeated the Medes, and for the first time the Persians gained their independence, laying the foundations of the great Persian Empire. And that's how the rise of the Persians began. Stepping out from the shadows of the Medes, this people, under Cyrus, made a powerful entrance onto the stage of history. Cyrus's conquests and the empire he built would mark a turning point not just for the Persians but for the entire world. And this was just the beginning, my dear friends. because the winds of Cyrus had yet to fully blow. Ah, my dear friends. Let's now turn our eyes to one of the biggest turning points in the history of the Persians, the beginning of that epic rise. While the path of Cyrus the Great was still just a dream, a spark was igniting deep within the Med Empire. Young Cyrus had grown up in the palace of his grandfather Astyages, witnessing his power up close. The Medes were one of the strongest kingdoms of their time. But friends, things aren't always as they appear on the outside. Beneath the Med throne was a people being crushed and oppressed. And it was from among those people that the leader would emerge, Cyrus. When the time came, Cyrus no longer hid his dream of freeing his people. Starting a rebellion against the Medes seemed impossible after all. Astyages' army was well equipped with the strength and experience that came with years. But my dear friends, victory isn't always won by the biggest armies. Cyrus sparked a revolt against the Medes by using his mind and heart. This rebellion was more than just a military struggle, it was a fight for a people to take their fate into their own hands. During those days, the Med army had begun to fragment from within. Cyrus's charisma and leadership had even begun to influence the Med soldiers. Many commanders loyal to Astyages were starting to feel the power of this young Persian prince and began to sympathize with him. When the first sparks of the uprising were ignited, Cyrus wasn't just accompanied by Persians, there were Medes among them supporting him, because Cyrus was a symbol of justice and freedom. Standing up against a tyrannical ruler wasn't just the desire of the Persians, it was a shared wish of everyone under Astyages' oppression. Cyrus was not only brave, but he was also a genius strategist. By breaking apart the Med army, he bolstered the courage of the Persians with each victory. Think about it, Persians were no longer a people bowing to the Med army, they had become a power fighting on equal terms. And finally, that great day arrived. Cyrus dealt the Med army a crushing defeat. But dear listeners, this battle wasn't just about clashing weapons and swords, it was a victory achieved through the power of the mind. When Astyages lost his throne and empire, Cyrus hadn't just toppled a ruler, he had laid the foundations of the Persian Empire. The Med Empire fell, and in its place rose a new empire under Cyrus's leadership. But friends, this new empire was built on Cyrus's understanding of justice. He didn't just rule over the lands he conquered, he embraced the Med people and didn't oppress them. This approach immortalized Cyrus not just as a conqueror, but as a wise leader. And so the Persians transformed from being just a people into an empire. For the people of that time, this was not just a political victory, it was the dawn of a new era. The Persian Empire, born under Cyrus's leadership, would be remembered not just for its military power, but also for its just governance. When Cyrus entered the Med capital of Ecbatana to declare his victory, he was recognized not just as a king, but as a unifier of peoples. Ah, dear listeners, this victory of Cyrus was the greatest step that paved the way for the Persian Empire. But this was only the beginning. Cyrus's conquests were far from over. Under his leadership, the Persians would make their names known throughout the world, bringing empires and peoples to their knees. Yet Cyrus would always prioritize the welfare of his people, establishing justice wherever he went. And thus, the rise of Cyrus would be etched in the pages of history in golden letters. Ah, my dear friends, let's turn our attention to one of the most significant turning points in Persian history, the beginning of that legendary rise. When the path of Cyrus the Great was still just a dream, a spark was already lighting deep within the Medes Empire. Young Cyrus grew up in his grandfather Astyages' palace, witnessing his power firsthand. The Medes were one of the strongest kingdoms of their time, but my friends, things aren't always as they seem. Beneath the Medes' throne, there were people being crushed and oppressed, and it was from those very people that the leader would emerge, Cyrus. When the time came, Cyrus no longer hid his dream of freeing his people. Starting a rebellion against the Medes seemed impossible after all. Astyages' army was well equipped with years of strength and experience. But my dear friends, victory doesn't always come from having the biggest army. Cyrus sparked a revolt against the Medes using his heart and mind. This rebellion wasn't just a military fight, it was about a people taking control of their own destiny. In those days, the Medes' army was starting to crumble from the inside. Cyrus's charisma and leadership began to inspire even the Medes' soldiers. Many commanders who were once loyal to Astyages started feeling the power of this young Persian prince and sympathized with him. When the first sparks of the uprising flew, Cyrus wasn't just backed by Persians, there were even Medes supporting him, because Cyrus symbolized justice and freedom. Standing up to a tyrant wasn't just what the Persians wanted, it was the shared dream of everyone suffering under Astyages' rule. Cyrus wasn't just brave, he was a brilliant strategist. By breaking the Medes' army apart, he boosted the Persians' courage with each victory. Think about it, Persians were no longer people bowing to the Medes' army, they were a force fighting on equal terms. And finally, that great day came. Cyrus delivered a crushing defeat to the Medes' army. But my dear listeners, this wasn't just about weapons clashing and swords fighting, it was a victory achieved through clever thinking. When Astyages lost his throne and empire, Cyrus didn't just overthrow a ruler, he laid the foundation for the Persian Empire. The Medes' empire fell, and in its place, a new empire rose under Cyrus's leadership. But friends, this new empire was built on Cyrus's sense of justice. He didn't just conquer lands, he embraced the Medes people and didn't oppress them. This approach made Cyrus more than just a conqueror, it made him a wise leader. And so the Persians transformed from just a people into an empire. For the people of that time, this wasn't just a political victory, it was the dawn of a new era. Under Cyrus's leadership, the Persian Empire would be known not only for its military power, but for its fair governance. When Cyrus entered the Medes' capital of Ecbatana to declare victory, he wasn't just seen as a king, but as a unifier of people. Ah, dear listeners, Cyrus's victory was the biggest step that opened the door to the Persian Empire. But this was only the beginning. Cyrus's conquests were far from over. Under his leadership, the Persians would make their name known around the world, bringing empires and nations to their knees. But Cyrus always put his people's well-being first, bringing justice wherever he went. And so the rise of Cyrus would be written in history with golden letters. Ah, my dear listeners, now I'm taking you on an unforgettable journey through the depths of history. This time our stop is Babylon, the shining star of its time, the cradle of civilizations. That magnificent city, with its massive walls, spiraling gardens, and powerful emperors, rose like it was competing with the gods on earth. But in the course of history, every peak has its end, right? And Babylon was standing on the edge of its own. When Cyrus set his sights on that grand Babylon, he knew he wasn't just aiming for conquest, but the birth of a new era. Babylon wasn't as powerful as it once was, my friends. The unrest within the city and the weakening structure of the empire presented a great opportunity for Cyrus. The people of Babylon were no longer happy with the rule of Nabonidus. These internal conflicts were not things that would escape Cyrus's attention, of course. Nabonidus, with his disconnect from the gods and neglect of his people, had left Babylon vulnerable, and Cyrus patiently waited to turn this weakness into a victory. When Cyrus gathered his army, the Persians had never aimed for such a great target before. Babylon's walls were world famous, and breaking through them seemed almost impossible. But instead of attacking the city directly, Cyrus chose a different path, smarter, more strategic. He altered the course of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These mighty rivers, which nourished and protected Babylon like a shield, were no match for Cyrus's brilliance. He diverted the waters, allowing his army to march through the dried river right under Babylon's walls. Ah, my dear listeners, imagine that moment. As Cyrus's armies slipped behind Babylon's walls, the people of the city had no idea what was happening. And so, my friends, without much bloodshed, Babylon fell. One of the most glorious cities in history became part of the Persian Empire, not with the clashing of swords, but through peaceful surrender. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he wasn't greeted as a conqueror, but as a savior. He showed great generosity toward the people of Babylon. He didn't touch the city under the protection of their god Marduk, nor did he restrict their freedom of worship. And dear listeners, perhaps one of Cyrus's greatest victories wasn't just freeing cities, but freeing people. He liberated the Jewish people from slavery and allowed them to return to their homeland. This event, recorded on the famous Cyrus cylinder, became one of the brightest symbols of his just rule. Cyrus's rule in Babylon wasn't just about expanding an empire. He was a leader who knew how to connect with the people of the lands he conquered. He respected the traditions and beliefs of the Babylonians. Because of this, Cyrus wasn't just remembered as a king who conquered, but as the protector of Babylon and the surrounding lands. The fall of Babylon went down in history as one of the greatest peaceful victories. The city's wealth and cultural heritage were added to the Persian Empire, but the spirit of Babylon was preserved through Cyrus's just governance. And so, my dear friends, Cyrus's conquest wasn't just the expansion of an empire, but a moment where justice, tolerance, and the mark of a great leader were imprinted on history. The conquest of Babylon was a victory that would forever inscribe Cyrus's name in golden letters, remembered by the people as a savior. Babylon. Even in your fall, you paved the way for the birth of a legend. My dear listeners, today I'm going to tell you about one of history's wisest and most just rulers, Cyrus the Great. As you know, Cyrus wasn't just a master of conquest or a mighty warrior. He was a leader who ruled his empire not just with his sword, but with his heart. His victories weren't just about gaining new lands, he touched the very soul of the territories he conquered. But how, you might ask? Let's dive into the unique policies Cyrus followed. Cyrus didn't rule the people he conquered through force, my friends. Instead, he approached their beliefs, languages, and cultures with deep respect. Whether entering Babylon or conquering Lydia, he was known for granting freedoms to the people. Think about it, most empires, as they expand, tend to oppress those they conquer. But Cyrus did the opposite. Rather than subjecting people to his rule, he gave them the freedom to continue practicing their religions, traditions, and cultures. And perhaps that's why Cyrus was remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol of justice and tolerance. Now, there's a document that perfectly reflects this tolerance, a document considered the first declaration of human rights in history. Yes, the Cyrus cylinder. He had this cylinder created after his conquest of Babylon, and inscribed on it are his words of justice, etched into history. It speaks of how Cyrus allowed the people of Babylon to live in peace without imposing his own beliefs on them. Freedom of religion and worship. How rare was that in the world of that time, right? Cyrus's leadership style earned him respect not just within his empire, but far beyond the lands he conquered. Friends, another reason Cyrus was so loved and respected was his sense of justice. He didn't oppress or burden his people. Under his rule, everyone felt safe. Few kings in history have managed to foster the kind of trust Cyrus had among his people. Even the Jewish people were grateful to him, not just as a ruler, but as a liberator. When he freed them from Babylonian captivity and allowed them to return to their homeland, it was a shining example of his just rule. Of course, this approach of tolerance and justice made his empire strong as well. Different peoples, instead of feeling oppressed, found peace under Cyrus's rule. This was one of the key reasons why his empire expanded to such vast borders and stood strong for so long. Even though he had a powerful army, Cyrus's true victory was in the hearts of his people. Every nation under his rule began to believe in a world where everyone could live in peace and harmony. So, my dear listeners, this was how Cyrus ruled. He was remembered not only for the victories he won on the battlefield, but also for the respect and tolerance he showed the people he ruled. His unique leadership didn't just build an empire, it left important lessons for humanity. Cyrus, one of the greatest kings in history, showed just how powerful justice can be as a weapon. The words engraved on the Cyrus cylinder still resonate today, don't they? People are free. This is the legacy left behind by a ruler who governed with justice and tolerance, shining brightly through the ages. My dear listeners, today I'm taking you to the final days of one of the greatest kings in history, Cyrus the Great. By that time, his name echoed not just as the ruler of a kingdom, but as the emperor of a vast empire. He had conquered Lydia in the west and Babylon in the south, offering peace and tolerance to the people he ruled. Yet Cyrus's ambition knew no bounds. His dreams couldn't be contained by the lands he had already conquered. His gaze had turned east, toward the endless steppes of distant Asia, where powerful tribes ruled. This would become one of Cyrus's most challenging and legendary campaigns. His eastern campaigns would redefine the fate of the Persian Empire, testing Cyrus's strength and strategic genius once again. As he marched towards Central Asia, the vast mountains of the Iranian plateau lay ahead, with his conquered, wealthy kingdoms behind him. The harsh climate of the steppes, the fierce nomadic tribes, and the unknown lands made this expedition even more difficult. But Cyrus's ambition was strong enough to overcome those obstacles. It was time to face the Massagetae, the fierce warrior tribe that had long ruled those lands. And this battle with the Massagetae would go down in history as one of the bloodiest clashes ever recorded. Then there was Queen Tamaris of the Massagetae. Tamaris. Her name would be remembered as a queen of incredible courage and determination, who fiercely defended her people. She didn't underestimate Cyrus's strength, but she had immense confidence in her own people's resilience. Cyrus, with his intelligence and strategy, had won many victories, but this time his fate was not so bright. When his armies met the Massagetae, a great battle ensued. This fight was not only for territory, but for the pride and ambition of two mighty leaders. Legend has it that Cyrus lost his life in that battle, a battle where the Massagetae left nothing behind in their quest for victory. Tamaris, driven by the grief and rage of losing her son, poured all her fury into defeating Cyrus on the battlefield. It's said that Tamaris took Cyrus's severed head, threw it into a skin filled with blood, and cried out, "You thirsted for blood, Cyrus. Now drink your fill." Those words captured the tragic end of one of history's greatest rulers. A life full of victories, brought to an end in the heart of battle. Cyrus's final campaign showed not only how he conquered lands, but how even he would be remembered for his defeats. But my dear listeners, even though this last campaign ended with Cyrus's death, it didn't diminish the strength of his legacy. His empire continued to grow and expand after his passing. His battle with Queen Tamaris made him a figure forever etched in history. For a ruler's strength isn't just measured by the victories they win, but by the challenges and resistance they face on the battlefield. And Cyrus, by facing all these challenges head-on, carved his name into history with gold. Cyrus's final campaign also offers us one more lesson. Dear friends, no matter how great or powerful one may be, every ruler on earth has their limits. And Cyrus found that limit in the eastern lands. But his legacy reached far beyond the borders of his empire. In both the East and the West, in every land he conquered, he was remembered for his justice, tolerance, and strength. And so, the great Cyrus's final campaign marked the end of his life. But the empire he built, and the legacy he left behind, lived on for many more years. And even today, as we tell the tale of that great ruler, we remember his justice and his leadership. My dear listeners, the story of Cyrus doesn't end here. In fact, with his death, history opens the doors to the great legacy left by an emperor whose name was etched in gold. On his final campaign, Cyrus faced the fierce winds of the steppes and stood against Queen Thamyris of the Massagetae in what would be his greatest battle. But this time, fate wasn't on his side. Thamyris' army managed to stand strong against the immense power of the Persians, and in this battle Cyrus lost his life. On the day he was killed, it wasn't just the fall of a ruler, it marked the end of an era. The legendary scene where Thamyris placed Cyrus' severed head into a bag of blood became a tale that was told for generations. Amid the bloody battles, the defeat of a leader. What a tragic end. Cyrus' death was the greatest obstacle in his quest to expand the empire's borders. But remember, my dear friends, great leaders don't live on through their bodies, but through the legacy they leave behind. Even after he drove his sword into the ground for the last time, Cyrus was remembered for the order and justice he had established. So what happened after? Though Cyrus' body remained on the battlefield, his spirit was never forgotten. After his death, a grand tomb was built for him in Pasargadae, in the heart of that magnificent land. Ah, Pasargadae. At the foot of towering mountains, embraced by endless steppes, the eternal resting place of the great Cyrus was erected. Even today, people stand before that tomb, whispering his name, remembering not just a king, but an entire era. That tomb in Pasargadae is much more than just a monument to a ruler's greatness. It's a symbol, reminding us of the man who laid the foundations of the Persian Empire and how an empire should be built. But Cyrus' legacy wasn't confined to just a tomb. Oh no, my dear listeners. Even after his death, his empire continued to thrive. The Persian Empire that Cyrus left behind soon became one of the most powerful and expansive empires in world history. The Achaemenid dynasty was built upon the solid foundations he had laid, and Cyrus' approach to ruling with justice and tolerance spread across the world. His way of governing became a model not only in the lands he conquered but for the rulers who came after him. Cyrus' death wasn't the fall of the empire, but rather a sign of its growth. Leaders like Darius and Cambyses, who followed him, took the vast empire Cyrus had founded to even greater heights. Each of them brought peace to their people by continuing his legacy of justice and tolerance. The Achaemenid dynasty is the greatest testament to the depth of Cyrus' vision. And today we can still see traces of the empire he built in many corners of the world. Ah, my dear listeners, the story of Cyrus teaches us something else. An emperor is remembered not just by the lands he conquers, but by the values he leaves behind. Cyrus was a leader who brought justice and tolerance to his people. His way of ruling showed that victories won in the hearts of people are far more lasting than those won on the battlefield. And that's why Cyrus is remembered not just as a conqueror, but as one of the greatest statesmen in history. And so, my dear friends, the end of Cyrus is truly the beginning of a new story. The Achaemenid dynasty that started with him made its mark on the world. Cyrus' legacy took root in Persian lands and shaped history. No matter how much time passes, we will continue to remember the name of that great king and tell his story. Ah, Cyrus, do you think the world will ever see another leader like you? Ah, my dear listeners, as we turn the pages of history, there are some names that echo not just in a specific time, but for centuries to come. Great Cyrus is one of those names. Thinking of him merely as a king of conquests and victories is a grave misunderstanding. Cyrus was a leader who profoundly impacted the mindsets of both the Eastern and Western worlds, and his traces have never faded through the ages. This man didn't just conquer lands, he won the hearts of people, facilitated the blending of cultures, and laid the foundations of the modern world order. Dear friends, to truly grasp Cyrus' impact on history, we must delve deep into the kind of leader he was. He didn't rule over the lands he conquered like a despot. Instead, he offered his people tolerance and justice. He granted freedom to the nations under his empire. He didn't interfere with their religions or cultures, rather, he protected them. These policies made him not just a conqueror but a statesman, even a visionary. That's why Cyrus became a guide and a model for subsequent rulers. Cyrus' influence on Western civilization is undeniably significant. Many Western leaders who followed in his footsteps adopted his style of governance. Did you know that Alexander the Great admired Cyrus greatly and wanted to identify with him? It is said that during his campaigns, Alexander visited Cyrus' tomb and viewed him as a sacred figure. This admiration shows how the art of governance practiced by Cyrus resonated in the West. Leaders like Alexander carried forward Cyrus' understanding of justice and tolerance into their own empires. From Rome to Byzantium, the leaders of the West drew inspiration from his ideals, following the path Cyrus had paved while ruling their own people. But Cyrus' influence wasn't limited to the West. He left deep marks in the East as well. The Achaemenid Empire he founded played a significant role in uniting Eastern peoples and building a civilization. Cyrus initiated a period of peace and stability in the East, opened trade routes, and built bridges between cultures. His policies shaped the political and cultural landscape of the East. The people of Iran viewed Cyrus not just as a king, but as a father figure. He was a leader who ruled with compassion. My dear listeners, Cyrus' legacy extends beyond conquests, empires, and leaders. He is also remembered as a human rights advocate who laid the foundations of the modern world. Have you heard of the Cyrus cylinder? This cylinder is considered the world's first declaration of human rights. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus commissioned this cylinder to proclaim that in the lands he conquered, freedom of religion, cultural rights, and justice would prevail. This document, seen as one of the earliest examples of modern human rights principles, proves that Cyrus was not just a military genius but also a leader who held great respect for human dignity and justice. Today, the legacy Cyrus left behind continues to inspire modern leaders. His respect for justice, tolerance, and the freedom of people has shaped the governance styles of many contemporary leaders. The values Cyrus championed have echoed through the ages, forming the bedrock of modern human rights doctrines. Indeed, the United Nations recognizes the Cyrus cylinder as the first document on human rights and considers it one of the foundations of the modern world. Dear friends, the place of Cyrus in history transcends that of a mere conqueror. The marks he left behind resonate in every corner of world history. He has become a leader of victories not only won by the sword but in the hearts of people. And that's why Cyrus' legacy continues to live on, rather than being buried in the dusty pages of history. Leaders who follow in his footsteps have embraced Cyrus' justice and tolerance, bringing prosperity to their people. In conclusion, my dear listeners, Cyrus' impact on world history is immense. He was a leader who shaped both Eastern and Western civilizations, etching his name in gold letters in the annals of history with his understanding of human rights, cultural tolerance, and justice. The legacy he left behind still endures in the modern world, reminding us of the deepest and most humane aspects of leadership. Dear Cyrus, even the shadow of a leader like you will continue to peacefully cast its light upon humanity for ages to come. Now I'm going to take you on a journey that brings you a step closer to understanding the greatness of Cyrus, my dear friends. Remember, Cyrus's victories weren't just won on the battlefield, it was his unique approach to governance and statecraft that held his empire together. Let's take a closer look at the building blocks of the empire established by great Cyrus. Cyrus was known not just for the power of his sword, but also for his sharp intellect. One of his greatest achievements in uniting such vast territories was his ability to manage them with an organized governance system, rather than trying to impose the same methods everywhere. Cyrus took into account the unique characteristics of each region. In an empire where different peoples, languages, and beliefs intertwined, finding a way to keep everyone happy was truly a genius move. At this point, Cyrus introduced the satrapy system. This system not only strengthened central authority but also gave local governors significant powers, taking into account the needs of the local populations. Each region was headed by a governor known as a satrap. These satraps lived closely with the local people and served the emperor loyally. In this way, Cyrus managed to preserve local cultures while still asserting his authority. This brilliant system ensured the empire was governed with stability for many years. The satraps were not just administrators, they were also the guarantors of justice and security. Cyrus established a strong bureaucratic structure to help the satraps fulfill their duties. Thanks to this structure, the empire could quickly process reports from all over and make decisions. The extensive network of roads that spread across the empire served as Cyrus's eyes and ears. These roads not only sped up trade but also allowed armies and state officials to move quickly. In fact, the communication system along these roads laid the foundation for royal postal services. A king's decisions could reach even the most distant provinces swiftly. Ah, my friends, this is why Cyrus was not just a conqueror but also an incredible statesman. Another innovation Cyrus introduced was the trade routes that strengthened the economic structure. The empire served as a bridge between the East and the West. While goods were exchanged in major markets, Cyrus assigned military units to ensure the safety of trade. These units protected the trade routes and merchants, ensuring sustainable economic prosperity. The security of trade within the empire also guaranteed the flow of gold and silver that filled Cyrus's treasury. However, dear listeners, the success of Cyrus wasn't just due to a strong economy or clever bureaucracy. His greatest genius was in expertly combining his military structure with this governance system. Each satrapy provided soldiers for Cyrus's army. Soldiers recruited from local populations joined the imperial army, thus integrating local powers into the empire. But that wasn't the end of it. Cyrus always kept his central army strong. His army was one of the best of its time, not just in numbers but also in strategy and tactics. He protected the lands he conquered not only with military strength, but also with clever commanders and a disciplined army. And of course, behind this great army lay Cyrus's sense of justice. He wasn't a cruel ruler to the people he conquered. He wanted justice to be applicable everywhere and for everyone. He granted the people in the conquered lands the freedom to maintain their beliefs. This was a governing style that earned Cyrus both the love of his people and the respect of his enemies. Dear friends, this is why Cyrus's empire was not just about conquests. His empire was a symbol of a system built on justice, reason, and humanity. Within this magnificent structure, everything operated in harmony. Trade, military power, justice, and governance worked together so seamlessly that the empire managed to stand strong for years. Now, my friends, I want to tell you how Cyrus's conquest didn't just change the territories of his empire, but also fundamentally altered the course of the world. Yes, the victories he achieved shaped not only the battlefields but also the geopolitical balances of the time, cultural interactions, and the pathways of trade. Let's take a look at how this great emperor's actions redrew the world map together. When Cyrus began his conquests, the world was a place where different powers were struggling for dominance. However, the series of victories he achieved would shake these balances and lead to the establishment of a brand new world order. Starting from the Medes and extending to Babylon and even Anatolia, his conquests brought the ancient civilizations of the Old World under his control. Even though he ruled with justice and compassion over the conquered lands, the former power holders of those territories, namely the local kings and elites, had no choice but to submit to this new Persian order. Thus, through Cyrus's conquests, the world became a place where the old powers weakened and a new authority rose. You might be wondering how this situation affected global geopolitics. Cyrus's conquests created a power vacuum, particularly in the regions of Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean. The ancient glory of Babylon faded into history, and the power of Lydia in Anatolia diminished. With this great change, the Persian Empire was building a new world order. Neighboring civilizations, especially Egypt and the Greek city-states, were paying close attention to this new power. Cyrus's empire was now felt everywhere as a major force. The Persian armies were sending a clear message to all the states in the region, not just through their conquest but also by showcasing their military strength. However, Cyrus was known not just for the sharpness of his sword but also for his diplomatic skills. Unlike many rulers before him, he didn't approach the leaders of the conquered lands or neighboring civilizations with hostility. His goal was to create a system that held people together rather than to destroy his enemies. This approach to diplomacy especially showed itself in his relationships with neighboring civilizations. The Greek city-states couldn't dare expand their territories under Cyrus's rule, while trade and cultural exchanges flourished rapidly. A short-lived peace was established with Egypt, until Egypt itself became a Persian province. Friends, Cyrus's conquests weren't limited to politics, they also introduced a new trade network to the world. The vast borders of the Persian Empire secured the trade routes that stretched from east to west. At that time, trade routes were like lifelines between civilizations. While merchants transported silk, spices, precious metals, and artworks, cultural interactions were expanding alongside them. The safe trade network that Cyrus established not only boosted the economy but also allowed cultural exchanges to grow rapidly. These trade routes facilitated interactions among the people of the empire. Languages, religions, and traditions blended together. Speaking of cultural exchange, we can't overlook the artistic and scientific impacts of Cyrus's conquests. He gathered artists, scientists, and thinkers from the lands he conquered into his court. The wise men of Babylon, the masters of Lydia, and the philosophers of Media all came together under Cyrus's shadow, contributing to the Persian Empire. This cultural wealth not only increased the prosperity of the empire, but also left a lasting mark on the region's history. As Cyrus's empire experienced a golden age both economically and culturally, its impact on the world was growing. His conquests shaped not only that era but also the centuries to come. The legacy of the Persian Empire inspired subsequent empires, even great Alexander himself. The trade routes opened by Cyrus continued to be used even after the fall of the empire, and cultural exchanges connected world civilizations to one another. Ah, my dear friends, we've reached the end of another long journey. This adventure that began with Cyrus's conquests has shown us how not just territories, but the fate of humanity has been shaped. This great leader, the founder of the Persian Empire, left behind a legacy far beyond the victories won on the battlefield. His sense of justice, the compassion he showed his people, and his diplomatic genius perhaps led to the establishment of one of the greatest empires in history. But let's not forget that these immense successes weren't solely based on Cyrus's power. His vision inspired both his people and future leaders. The Persian Empire rose on the foundations he laid. The governance system, trade routes, cultural riches, and diplomatic strategies he created resonated across the world for centuries. So what happened after Cyrus's empire? How was this greatness maintained? Or perhaps how did it start to unravel over time? Did conquerors like Alexander the Great follow in his footsteps? Or did the legacy of the Persian Empire continue in other forms? Together we will uncover who would step onto the historical stage at every turn and who might be forgotten. For now we stand in the enormous shadow of Cyrus, feeling the echoes of his legacy. As we gather around this fire, I want to remind you that history is not just the story of kings and conquests. History is also about the lives of the people living in those lands, their daily lives, and those small moments. The marks left by these great emperors are not only about epic battles and victories, they're woven from the intricate fabric of relationships between peoples, the growth of trade, and the exchanges of culture. My dear friends, what we've discussed here isn't just the dusty pages of the past. The past is a mirror that sheds light on the future. Cyrus's life and the empire he built are stories reflected in that mirror, offering us lessons and inspiration. His world-changing steps still resonate today across cultures, nations, and civilizations. Now, as we reach the end of this long tale, I invite you to reflect on this. What lessons do these great figures of the past have for us? Perhaps we can learn from their mistakes and draw inspiration from their successes. But most importantly, it's about how each of us will leave our mark in our own history. Maybe one day your stories will also be told and inspire those gathered around the fire. Friends, I'm grateful once again for this journey we've taken together in this vast sea called history. I look forward to sharing many more stories, heroes, and forgotten events with you in the future. Until then, may the wisdom of the past always be with you. Remember, every great story begins with the next step. Farewell, my history-loving friends.